a scorching desert morning in 1885, a desperate orphan boy was racing toward his one chance at survival, a job interview at the territory's largest ranch. But when he came across a well-dressed stranger struggling with a broken wagon wheel on the dusty trail, he made a choice that would cost him everything. Or so he thought. What young Eli didn't know was that the mysterious man he stopped to help was Judge Samuel Hawthorne, the most powerful figure in all of Dustridge territory. What happened next would change an orphan's life forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community. Now, let me tell you about the day that proved sometimes doing the right thing leads to the most unexpected rewards. The sun hadn't yet crested the jagged peaks of Dustridge territory when 17-year-old Elijah Carter stepped out of Widow's Peak Orphanage for what he hoped would be the last time. The wooden building behind him sagged under years of harsh desert winds and scarce funding, its paint peeling like old skin, shutters hanging crooked on rusted hinges. This place had been his whole world for as long as he could remember. But today, everything would change. Eli adjusted the battered hat on his head, a hand-me-down from some long-forgotten benefactor, and checked his reflection in the cracked window of the orphanage's front door. Lean and wiry from years of hard work and modest meals, he carried himself with the quiet determination of someone who'd learned early that the world owed him nothing. His clothes were clean but patched, brown trousers mended at the knees, a white cotton shirt that had seen better days, and boots that were more repair than original leather. Still, Mrs. Abigail Morrison had done her best to make him presentable. "You look fine, Eli," she'd said that morning, her weathered hands smoothing down his collar one last time. "Just remember what I taught you. Look them in the eye, speak clearly, and show them the good man you've become." The good man. Eli almost smiled at that. At 17, he felt ancient some days, carrying responsibilities that most boys his age never knew. He'd been the one the younger orphans looked to when the winter food ran low, the one who'd taught them to read when Mrs. Morrison was too tired, the one who'd stood between them and the older bullies from town. But today wasn't about being good. It was about survival. The letter in his pocket crinkled as he walked, the paper worn soft from being read and reread dozens of times. Tom Bradley, foreman of Iron Ridge Ranch, had agreed to meet with him about a ranch hand position. The Blackwood Company that owned Iron Ridge was the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, and a job there meant steady wages, a bunk to sleep in, and 3 meals a day. More than that, it meant a future. Eli had written 12 letters to 12 different ranches over the past month. Only one had replied. "This is your shot, son," Mrs. Morrison had reminded him at breakfast, her eyes bright but worried. "Iron Ridge don't usually hire boys your age, especially not—" She'd trailed off, but Eli knew what she meant. Especially not orphans. Especially not boys with no family name, no connections, no references except for the word of a woman who ran a charity house. The orphanage sat on the outskirts of Copper Creek, a dust-blown town that survived on the generosity of passing cattle drives and the stubbornness of its residents. Most of the boys who aged out of Widow's Peak ended up working odd jobs in town, mucking stables or hauling supplies for pennies a day. Some drifted away entirely, disappearing into the vast territory like tumbleweeds in the wind. The lucky few found apprenticeships or married young to escape their circumstances. Eli had bigger plans. He'd studied the land records at the courthouse, learned which ranches were expanding, which owners had reputations for fairness. The Blackwood Company paid well and treated their hands decent, according to the talk in Morning Star Saloon. More importantly, they promoted from within. A good worker could become a foreman in 5 years, maybe save enough to buy his own spread eventually. The morning air was already warming as Eli made his way toward the livery stable, where he'd arranged to borrow a horse for the 20-mile ride to Iron Ridge Ranch. His stomach twisted with nervous energy, but he forced his steps to stay steady. He'd practiced what he'd say 100 times, memorized every detail about cattle ranching he could get his hands on, prepared for every question Tom Bradley might ask. What he hadn't prepared for was the broken wagon wheel and the well-dressed stranger that would soon test everything Mrs. Morrison had taught him about doing right, even when it cost you everything. The interview was set for 10 o'clock sharp. Eli had planned to arrive early, make a good impression, prove his reliability. Some plans, he would soon learn, were meant to be broken. The borrowed mare beneath Eli was older than he'd hoped, but steady, her hooves finding sure footing on the well-worn trail that connected Copper Creek to the larger ranches scattered across Dustridge territory. Old Pete at the livery had been reluctant to let the horse go at first, squinting at Eli with the suspicion most folks reserved for orphans and drifters. "She ain't much to look at, boy, but Rosie here will get you where you need to go," Pete had finally said, accepting the 2 bits Eli had saved from odd jobs around town. "Just bring her back in one piece, you hear?" Eli had nodded solemnly, knowing those 2 bits represented nearly everything he had to his name. The remaining coins in his pocket, 37 cents, were meant for emergencies only. After today, he'd either have steady wages coming in, or he'd be back to scraping by on Mrs. Morrison's charity and whatever work he could find in Copper Creek's dusty streets. The sun climbed higher as Rosie carried him across the rolling landscape of sagebrush and scattered Joshua trees. The territory stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in shades of gold and rust under the morning light. In the distance the mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks still touched with snow despite the warming season. This was hard country, unforgiving to the weak or unprepared. But Eli had grown up here. The desert heat didn't bother him, nor did the vast emptiness that made some folks feel lost and small. Canyon Pass Road was the main artery connecting the scattered settlements of Dustridge territory, wide enough for freight wagons and cattle drives, rutted from years of heavy use. Eli had traveled this route only once before, 3 years ago, when Mrs. Morrison had taken him and 2 other boys to Millfield for a church social. He remembered being awed by the size of the county seat, the grand courthouse with its bell tower, the shops with glass windows displaying goods he'd never seen in Copper Creek. Today, though, his destination lay in the opposite direction. Iron Ridge Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, nestled in a valley where Silver Creek provided year-round water for cattle and horses. The Blackwood Company had built their empire there over the past 20 years, growing from a modest homestead to one of the most successful operations in 3 territories. Eli pulled out his father's pocket watch, the only thing of his parents he possessed, and checked the time. 8:15. He was making good time, the miles falling away beneath Rosie's steady gait. At this pace, he'd reach Iron Ridge with nearly an hour to spare, plenty of time to water his horse, dust off his clothes, and compose himself before meeting Tom Bradley. The foreman's letter had been brief but encouraging. "Present yourself at the main house at 10 o'clock sharp. Come prepared to demonstrate your knowledge of cattle and ranch work. This is a working interview. Dress accordingly." Eli had spent hours researching everything he could about the cattle business, practicing knots, studying the different breeds and their characteristics. He could talk intelligently about breeding programs, grazing rotation, and seasonal ranch operations. More than that, he had the hunger for it. While other boys his age dreamed of striking it rich in the gold fields or making their fortunes in the growing cities back east, Eli had always been drawn to ranch life. There was something honest about working with cattle and horses, something solid about building a life from the ground up on good land. He'd spent countless hours at the small corral behind the orphanage, helping to care for the few animals Mrs. Morrison kept, learning their ways and earning their trust. The morning was perfect for riding. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the temperature still comfortable before the desert heat would become oppressive later in the day. Eli felt his confidence growing with each mile. This was his moment, his chance to prove that an orphan boy from Copper Creek could work as hard as anyone, could be trusted with responsibility, could build something meaningful with his life. He had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours he would face a choice that would test every principle Mrs. Morrison had instilled in him. The broken wagon wheel and the mysterious stranger were still miles ahead, waiting on a dusty stretch of Canyon Pass road where destiny often wore the disguise of ordinary trouble. For now, there was only the rhythm of hoofbeats, the promise of opportunity, and the wide-open future stretching before him like the endless territorial sky. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the desert floor, but the sky above remained a flawless blue. Eli reined in Rosie and stood up in his stirrups, shading his eyes against the climbing sun. To the east, a dark cloud was rising from the valley floor. Not storm clouds, but dust, thick and choking, kicked up by something moving fast across the hardpan. "Easy, girl," he murmured to the mare, as she shifted nervously beneath him, her ears pricked forward toward the disturbance. As the dust cloud drew closer, Eli could make out the source, a massive cattle drive, at least 200 head by his count, moving north toward the railroad at Millfield. The longhorns spread across the trail in a river of brown and white hides, their horns catching the sunlight like polished bone. Cowboys flanked the herd on horseback, their faces masked with bandanas against the choking dust, working with the practiced efficiency of men who'd driven cattle across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. The trail boss spotted Eli and rode over, his horse dancing sideways to avoid the press of cattle. "You best get off the road, son," he called out, his voice rough with dust and authority. "This herd's been spooked twice already this morning. Rattlers in the brush and a mountain cat stalking the flanks. They're jumpy as church mice in a thunderstorm." Eli nodded and guided Rosie well off the road, watching as the seemingly endless procession of cattle streamed past. The dust was thick enough to taste, coating his clothes and making his eyes water. Each minute that ticked by was another minute closer to his appointment, but there was nothing to do but wait. Trying to push through the herd would be suicide. Spooked longhorns could trample a horse and rider without ever knowing they'd done it. 20 minutes passed before the last stragglers cleared the road, followed by the chuck wagon and remuda of spare horses. The trail boss tipped his hat as he rode past. "Much obliged for your patience, boy. Safe travels." As the dust settled, Eli checked his father's watch again. 9:20. His stomach clenched with the first real surge of panic. The delay had cost him precious time, and he still had 8 miles to cover. He'd have to push Rosie hard to make it. Harder than he'd wanted to with a borrowed horse that wasn't young anymore. "Come on, girl," he said, urging the mare into a canter. "We can still make it." But the desert wasn't finished with him yet. 3 miles further down Canyon Pass Road, the trail curved around a massive boulder formation, and Eli found his way blocked again. A freight wagon had broken an axle trying to navigate the rocky turn, its load of mining equipment scattered across the road like the bones of some mechanical beast. The teamster and his partner were struggling to lever the heavy wagon off the trail, their faces red with exertion and frustration. "Afternoon," the teamster called out, straightening his aching back. "Road's gonna be blocked for another hour at least, maybe 2. This axle's busted clean through, and we got 3 tons of machinery to shift before we can clear the way." Eli's heart sank. There was no other route to Iron Ridge Ranch. The desert on either side of the road was too rough for a horse, filled with arroyos and rocky outcroppings that could break a mount's leg in seconds. He could help the teamsters clear the road faster, but even then, he'd never make his 10 o'clock appointment. The sun was climbing toward its zenith now, the temperature rising with each passing minute. Sweat gathered under his hat and soaked through his carefully pressed shirt. The clothes that had seemed respectable at dawn now felt rumpled and stained with dust from the cattle drive. 9:45. The numbers on his father's watch face seemed to mock him, each tick of the second hand marking another moment of his opportunity slipping away. Even if the road cleared right now, even if he rode Rosie at a dangerous gallop across terrain that demanded caution, he'd be at least 30 minutes late. In the distance, he could see another dust cloud approaching from the south, another traveler on Canyon Pass Road, heading north like himself. Maybe they'd have better luck than he was having, Eli thought bitterly. Maybe they'd planned better, started earlier, been smarter about the risks. He had no way of knowing that the approaching wagon carried the very man who could change his life forever, or that fate was about to present him with a choice between his dreams and his character. The broken axle lay across the road like a judgment, and time kept slipping away like sand through his fingers. By the time the freight wagon was finally dragged clear of Canyon Pass Road, Eli's pocket watch read 10:15. The appointment he'd waited weeks for, prepared for endlessly, staked his entire future on. It was gone. Tom Bradley was probably already interviewing the next candidate. Some ranch-bred boy with a family name and references that meant something. Eli sat slumped in Rosie's saddle, staring at the empty road ahead that led to Iron Ridge Ranch. The smart thing would be to turn around, head back to Copper Creek, and accept that some chances only came once. But something stubborn in him, the same quality that had kept him fighting through 17 years of uncertainty, wouldn't let him quit without trying. "Come on, girl," he murmured to the mare. "Maybe they'll still see us. Maybe there's still a chance." He urged Rosie into a steady canter, pushing as hard as he dared on the sun-baked trail. The desert heat was building now, shimmering off the hardpan in waves that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. His shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and dust coated everything, his clothes, his skin, even the inside of his mouth. That's when he saw the wagon. It sat tilted at an awkward angle about 50 yards off the main road, near a cluster of barrel cactus and stunted mesquite trees. The right rear wheel had come completely free of its hub, lying flat against the desert floor like a giant wooden coin. A single horse stood patiently in the traces, head down, sides heaving with exhaustion. Beside the broken wagon, a man in a fine black suit was wrestling with a heavy spare wheel, trying to maneuver it into position without proper tools or leverage. Even from a distance, Eli could see he was fighting a losing battle. The wheel was too heavy for one man to handle alone, especially in this heat, and the gentleman's city clothes were already soaked through with sweat and coated with dust. Eli's first instinct was to keep riding. He was already impossibly late, his one shot at Iron Ridge Ranch slipping further away with every minute. This wasn't his problem. The well-dressed stranger had clearly chosen to travel the desert roads without proper preparation. No tools, no help, no understanding of how unforgiving this country could be to the unprepared. But as he drew closer, something made him slow Rosie to a walk. The man had stopped his futile wrestling with the wheel and was leaning heavily against the wagon's side, his face flushed red with heat and exertion. His breathing was labored, and his hands shook slightly as he removed his hat to wipe his brow. This wasn't just inconvenience, this was danger. A man his age, in this heat, stranded miles from water or shelter, could die out here if the sun got much higher. Eli heard Mrs. Morrison's voice in his head, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. Character isn't what you do when people are watching, Eli. It's what you do when you think nobody will ever know. He pulled up on the reins and sat motionless for a long moment, the weight of decision pressing down on him, heavier than the desert sun. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of, lay just 8 miles up the road at Iron Ridge Ranch. Tom Bradley would already be wondering where he was, probably already writing him off as unreliable, just another orphan boy who talked big but couldn't deliver. But the stranger was in real trouble, the kind of trouble that could turn fatal if the day got much hotter and no help came along. Canyon Pass Road wasn't heavily traveled. Another wagon might not pass for hours. Eli looked at his father's watch one more time. 10:28. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to keep riding, to salvage what he could of his opportunity, to put his own future first for once in his life. Instead, he turned Rosie toward the broken wagon. "Afternoon, sir," he called out as he approached, dismounting and tying his mare to a sturdy mesquite branch. "Looks like you could use a hand with that wheel." The stranger looked up, surprise and relief washing across his weathered face. He was older than Eli had first thought, maybe 60, with silver-gray hair and intelligent eyes that held both authority and genuine gratitude. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of education and position, "you might just be saving my life." Eli rolled up his sleeves and walked toward the broken wagon, toward the choice that would define everything that came after. "Well then," he said simply, "let's get you back on the road." The spare wheel was heavier than it looked. Solid oak reinforced with iron bands, built to last, but murderous to maneuver in the blazing desert heat. Eli positioned himself on one side while the stranger took the other, and together they began the careful process of aligning the wheel with the wagon's axle hub. "You've done this before," the older man observed, breathing hard as they worked to lift the wheel into position. Despite his fine clothes and city manners, he wasn't afraid of hard work, throwing his full weight behind the effort. "Yes, sir," Eli replied, muscles straining as they hoisted the wheel higher. "Grew up fixing whatever broke around the orphanage, wagons, plows, water pumps. If it had moving parts, I learned how to mend it." The stranger paused for a moment, studying Eli with new interest. "Orphanage?" "Widow's Peak, over in Copper Creek," Eli said, grunting as they finally got the wheel aligned with the hub. "Mrs. Morrison runs it. Good woman, taught us all to pull our own weight and help others when we could." Working together, they managed to slide the wheel onto the axle, but securing it properly required tools that the stranger's wagon didn't carry. A proper wrench for the hub nuts, wedges to hold everything in place while they tightened the fittings. Eli looked around the immediate area and spotted what he needed: a flat rock for hammering, a sturdy branch that could serve as a lever, some loose stones to wedge behind the wheel. The sun was merciless now, beating down on them like a blacksmith's hammer. Sweat poured off both men as they worked, their clothes soaked through, faces flushed with heat and exertion. Eli's carefully pressed shirt was ruined, stained with axle grease and desert grime. His hands were black with dirt and metal filings. "What's your name, son?" the stranger asked as Eli tightened the final hub nut, using the branch as a makeshift wrench. "Elijah Carter, sir. Most folks call me Eli." "Well, Eli, I'm Samuel Hawthorne, and I owe you more than I can properly express." He extended his hand, and Eli shook it, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested Judge Hawthorne, though Eli didn't know his title yet. Wasn't entirely a stranger to manual labor. "Just glad I could help, Mr. Hawthorne. This road can be dangerous for a man traveling alone." As they finished securing the wheel, Eli kept glancing at his father's pocket watch. 11:15, 11:30, 11:45. Each passing minute drove home the reality of what he'd given up. By now, Tom Bradley had definitely moved on to other candidates. The position at Iron Ridge Ranch was gone, lost to the desert heat and his own stubborn conscience. "You keep checking that watch," Hawthorne observed, wiping his hands on a kerchief that had started the day pristine white. "Am I keeping you from something important?" Eli hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Had a job interview this morning, sir. At Iron Ridge Ranch. Was supposed to be there at 10 sharp. He managed a rueful smile. "Guess I'll be looking for work somewhere else now." Hawthorne's expression grew serious. "You gave up a job interview to help a stranger?" "Wasn't really a choice, sir. Couldn't leave you stranded out here in this heat. Some things matter more than personal opportunity." The older man studied Eli for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Iron Ridge Ranch, you said. What kind of position? Ranch hand, maybe working up to something more if I proved myself. Eli shrugged, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. The Blackwood Company's got a reputation for treating their people fair, paying decent wages. Would have been a good start. And now? Eli looked around at the empty desert, the endless vista of sage and stone stretching in every direction. Now I guess I head back to Copper Creek and figure out what's next. Maybe one of the smaller ranches will give an orphan boy a chance. Hawthorne climbed back onto his wagon seat, gathering up the reins. The repair job had worked. The wheel turned smoothly, holding firm under the wagon's weight. Which direction were you headed, Eli? North, same as you, looks like. Climb up. I'll give you a ride back to where you left your horse. As they rolled across the desert toward where Rosie waited patiently in the mesquite shade, Eli tried not to think about what might have been. He'd made his choice, and he'd make it again. But that didn't make the disappointment any easier to swallow. He had no idea that the man sitting beside him held the power to change everything. The ride back to Copper Creek passed in a haze of dust and regret. Eli had parted ways with Samuel Hawthorne at the spot where Rosie waited, declining the older man's offer to drive him all the way home. Some disappointments, he'd learned, were better faced alone. Now, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, Eli guided the borrowed mare through the familiar streets of his hometown. The buildings looked smaller somehow, more weathered and tired than they had that morning when he'd left with such high hopes. The general store's painted sign was fading. The saloon's bat-wing doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the dust seemed thicker, more permanent, settling into every crack and crevice like resignation made visible. Old Pete looked up from shoeing a mule as Eli approached the livery stable. The hostler's eyes took in the young man's disheveled appearance, clothes wrinkled and stained, face streaked with sweat and grime, hat sitting askew on his dust-matted hair. "Back early, ain't you, boy?" Pete observed, not unkindly. Thought that interview was supposed to last most of the day. "Things didn't go as planned," Eli replied, dismounting and beginning to unsaddle Rosie. The mare nickered softly, sensing his mood. "She did good, though. Steady as you promised." Pete nodded, taking the saddle from Eli's hands. "Sometimes the best plans get waylaid by circumstances beyond our control. Don't mean we failed, just means the road took a different turn than we expected." The walk from the livery to Widow's Peak Orphanage felt longer than usual. Eli's boots scuffed against the packed earth of the street, kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. A few townspeople nodded as he passed. Mrs. Chen sweeping her porch, young Tommy Rodriguez playing with a stick and hoop outside his family's adobe house. Their casual greetings felt like echoes from another life, from the morning when he'd still believed his future lay waiting at Iron Ridge Ranch. Mrs. Morrison was tending her small vegetable garden when Eli finally reached the orphanage. She looked up at his approach, her weathered hands still clutching a handful of weeds, her eyes immediately reading the story written in his posture and expression. "Oh, honey," she said softly, rising to her feet and dusting off her apron. "Come sit with me on the porch and tell me what happened." They settled into the old wooden chairs that had hosted countless conversations over the years, about nightmares and dreams, about the children who'd come and gone, about the future that always seemed just beyond reach for kids with no family names or inherited advantages. Eli told her everything: the cattle drive delay, the broken freight wagon, the impossible choice he'd faced when he found Samuel Hawthorne stranded with his broken wheel. Mrs. Morrison listened without interruption, her lined face showing no surprise, only the quiet understanding of someone who'd raised 17 years' worth of children to make difficult choices. "You did right, Eli," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I'm proud of you, though I know that doesn't pay bills or put food on the table." I keep thinking maybe I should have kept riding, Eli admitted, staring out at the desert that stretched beyond the orphanage walls. Maybe someone else would have come along to help him. Maybe I threw away my only real chance for nothing. Mrs. Morrison reached over and placed her weathered hand on his arm. Character isn't something you can turn on and off like a lamp, son. It's who you are all the time, in every choice you make. That man would have died out there in this heat if you hadn't stopped. No job is worth a man's life, no matter how much you needed it. As evening shadows began to stretch across the orphanage yard, Eli sat with the woman who'd raised him, listening to the familiar sounds of home, the younger children playing in the dusty courtyard, the creak of old wood settling in the cooling air, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to water somewhere in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow he'd start looking for work again. Maybe one of the smaller ranches would hire him, or perhaps he'd find something in town. The dream of Iron Ridge Ranch was dead, but he was still alive, still capable, still willing to work hard for whatever opportunities remained. He couldn't know that 30 miles away, in the grand courthouse of Millfield, Samuel Hawthorne was asking his assistant to find out everything she could about a young man named Elijah Carter from Copper Creek. The story wasn't over. Sometimes the most important chapters began after you thought the book had already ended. 3 days later, Eli was mucking stalls at Henderson's Feed and Grain when Martha Hawthorne arrived in Copper Creek. She drove a small, elegant buggy pulled by a matched pair of chestnuts, her appearance so out of place in the dusty frontier town that heads turned and conversations stopped as she made her way down Main Street. Mrs. Morrison answered the knock at the orphanage door to find a well-dressed woman in her 40s, wearing a traveling dress of deep blue wool and carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to important business. "Good afternoon," Martha said, her voice cultured but warm. "I'm looking for a young man named Elijah Carter. I understand he lives here?" "He does," Mrs. Morrison replied carefully, studying this unexpected visitor. "May I ask who's calling?" "My name is Martha Hawthorne. I work for Judge Samuel Hawthorne of the Territorial Court. The judge would very much like to speak with young Mr. Carter, if he's available." Mrs. Morrison's eyes widened. Everyone in Dustridge Territory knew Judge Hawthorne by reputation, a fair but uncompromising man who'd brought law and order to a region that had known precious little of either before his appointment. What business could such a powerful man have with an orphan boy from Copper Creek? Eli was summoned from the feed store, arriving at the orphanage still smelling of hay and horse sweat, his hands stained with honest work. When he saw Martha Hawthorne waiting in Mrs. Morrison's small sitting room, confusion flickered across his face. "Mr. Carter," Martha began, consulting a small leather notebook, "3 days ago you assisted a gentleman whose wagon had broken down on Canyon Pass Road. Do you recall the incident?" "Yes, ma'am," Eli replied slowly. "Mr. Samuel Hawthorne. His wheel came off the hub. We fixed it together." Martha nodded, making a note. "And in doing so, you were late for an appointment at Iron Ridge Ranch?" Eli's cheeks reddened slightly. "Yes, ma'am. Missed it entirely, actually." "The judge would like you to know," Martha continued, her tone becoming warmer, "that he made some inquiries about that appointment. It seems Tom Bradley, the foreman who was supposed to interview you, had already decided to hire his nephew for the position. The interview was merely a formality to satisfy the Blackwood Company's hiring policies." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. All his preparation, all his hopes, all his careful planning, it had been for nothing from the start. The job was never really available to him, never truly within reach. Mrs. Morrison's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. "Oh, honey," she murmured. But Martha wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "the judge was quite impressed with your character and your skills. He's asked me to extend an invitation." She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew an official-looking envelope sealed with red wax. "Judge Hawthorne would like you to come to Millfield tomorrow morning. He has a proposition that might interest you." Eli accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, staring at the heavy paper and elaborate seal. A proposition? The territorial court system is expanding, Martha explained. Judge Hawthorne needs a clerk and general assistant. Someone reliable, someone with good judgment, someone who can be trusted with important responsibilities. The position comes with a salary of $40 a month, room and board in Millfield, and the opportunity to study law under the judge's supervision. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Mrs. Morrison's old mantel clock. $40 a month was more money than Eli had ever imagined earning. Room and board meant security, stability, and the chance to study law, to maybe become something more than just another drifter trying to scratch out a living in the desert. "I don't understand," Eli said finally. "Why me? He barely knows me." Martha smiled for the first time since her arrival. "The judge has a saying, Mr. Carter. He says you can tell everything you need to know about a man's character by watching what he does when he thinks nobody important is looking. That day on Canyon Pass Road, you had every reason to keep riding. Instead, you stopped to help a stranger, at considerable cost to yourself." She stood to leave, smoothing down her traveling dress. That's exactly the kind of man Judge Hawthorne wants working beside him. As Martha's buggy disappeared down the dusty street, Eli stared at the envelope in his hands, hardly daring to believe what he'd just heard. The stranger whose wheel he'd fixed wasn't just any traveler. He was the most powerful man in Dustridge territory, and somehow, impossibly, Eli had passed a test he never knew he was taking. 6 months later, Eli Carter stood in the grand courthouse of Millfield, wearing a crisp white shirt, black vest, and the kind of polished boots he'd once only dreamed of owning. The transformation wasn't just in his appearance. It was in the way he carried himself. The confidence that came from knowing his place in the world was earned rather than given. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Judge Hawthorne's chambers, illuminating the law books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Eli had read many of those volumes over the past months, his evenings spent studying by lamplight in his comfortable room above the courthouse. What had started as basic clerk duties, filing papers, copying documents, managing the judge's correspondence, had evolved into something far more substantial. "The Patterson land dispute is scheduled for this afternoon," Eli reported, consulting the leather-bound appointment book that never left his side. "Both parties have submitted their final arguments, and I've prepared summaries of the relevant territorial statutes for your review." Judge Hawthorne looked up from the legal brief he was reading, a slight smile creasing his weathered features. "Your legal research has become quite thorough, Eli. That summary of water rights law you prepared last week was better than what most trained attorneys could produce." The compliment warmed Eli more than he cared to admit. Under the judge's patient tutelage, he discovered an aptitude for law that surprised them both. The same careful attention to detail that had served him well, fixing broken wagons and mending fences at the orphanage, translated perfectly to parsing legal documents and understanding the intricate web of territorial statutes. "There's something else," Judge Hawthorne continued, setting aside his papers. "I've been corresponding with colleagues in the territorial capital. There's talk of establishing a formal apprenticeship program for young men interested in legal careers. I've recommended you as the first candidate." Eli's breath caught in his throat. A formal apprenticeship would mean real legal training, the kind that could lead to taking the bar examination, to becoming a lawyer in his own right. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it. The program would require 3 years of study, but you'd continue working here while you learned. By the time you're 21, you could be practicing law anywhere in the territory." The judge's eyes held the same steady confidence they'd shown that day on Canyon Pass Road. "You have the mind for it, Eli, and more importantly, you have the character." Through the tall windows, Eli could see the bustling streets of Millfield, merchants conducting business, families going about their daily lives, the ordered civilization that good laws and fair judgment made possible. 6 months ago, he'd been just another orphan boy with no prospects and no connections. Now he was being offered a future he'd never dared to imagine. "I keep thinking about that morning," Eli said quietly. "If I'd known who you were, if I'd realized what stopping to help might lead to—" Judge Hawthorne held up a hand, shaking his head firmly. "But that's exactly the point, son. You didn't know. You stopped because it was the right thing to do, not because you expected any reward. That's what character truly means. Doing right when no one is watching, when there's no benefit to yourself." The older man stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the town below. "I've spent 30 years in law, Eli, and I've learned that all the legal knowledge in the world means nothing without a moral foundation. You can teach someone to interpret statutes and argue cases, but you can't teach them to care about justice, to put principle above personal gain." A knock at the chamber door interrupted them. Martha Hawthorne entered with a stack of correspondence and a warm smile for Eli. Over the months, she'd become something of a mentor herself, teaching him the intricacies of legal correspondence and court procedures. "The mail from the territorial capital has arrived," she announced, "including a letter for you, Eli." "It looks official." Eli accepted the envelope with curious fingers, breaking the wax seal to reveal a formal document bearing the territorial seal. As he read, his eyes widened with amazement. "What is it?" Judge Hawthorne asked. It's from the territorial governor," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's heard about my work here. He's asking if I'd be interested in a position with the territorial legal department in the capital." Judge Hawthorne's smile was proud but unsurprised. "Opportunities have a way of finding good men, Eli. The question is, what do you want to do?" Eli looked around the chambers that had become his second home, at the judge who'd become both mentor and father figure, at the life that had grown from a simple act of kindness on a dusty desert road. The scared, desperate boy who'd raced toward Iron Ridge Ranch was gone, replaced by a young man with real prospects and genuine choices. "I want to stay," he said finally. "I want to learn everything you can teach me about law and justice. The capital can wait. I've got work to do here first." Judge Hawthorne extended his hand, and Eli shook it firmly, man to man, equal to equal. "Then let's get back to work, counselor." Outside, the desert sun climbed higher over Millfield, casting its light on a world where character still mattered, where doing right still led to reward, and where an orphan boy's choice to help a stranger had opened doors to a future brighter than any dream. Sometimes the most important journeys began not when you knew your destination, but when you simply chose to do what was right along the way. Join us next time for another inspiring story of how simple acts of kindness can change everything. Don't forget to like this video if Eli's story moved you, and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier, where character was the only currency that truly mattered. Let us know in the comments. What choice would you have made on that dusty desert road?